So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at neurons and learning a little bit about their structure and discussing some of their functions. So neurons are large, very complex cells. They can be, when I say large, I mean they have very long processes on them. Some of them do. For instance, there are neurons that have their cell bodies located near or inside of the spinal cord, and then an axon that runs all the way down the length of the leg out to the toe, for instance. So very large cells and lots of complexities to them. But they're specialized to transmit what are referred to as nerve impulses. We're going to see them described later as action potentials, and you've heard that term before. We used that term when we were talking about muscles as well. So nerve impulses are action potentials, and they transmit these impulses from one part of the body to another in order to communicate. They're very long-lived. In fact, once you're fully mature, you're not going to make any new neurons, but you'll be living with the neurons that you've got and unfortunately losing them, a number of them every day, especially as we begin to age. They are what is referred to as amitotic. That means that they cannot undergo mitosis. They are not capable of reproducing. And so if they are destroyed, they can't be replaced. And finally, they have a very high metabolic rate. And because of this, they require almost continuous supplies of glucose and of oxygen in order to make the ATP necessary to run all the cellular processes that are associated with a neuron. So lots and lots of ATP required. So that means lots and lots of glucose. And glucose is the only source of energy that they are capable of using. So neurons have three functional components. They have a receptive region, a conducting component portion, and a secretory region where output is released. So the receptive region is what receives sensory data or inputted data. So it receives information in the form of chemical signals, usually, sometimes mechanical signals as well. And then there's a conducting portion that generates and then transmits an action potential, a nerve impulse. And then finally, at the output region of a neuron, there's a zone that releases neurotransmitters. And I say when instructed to do so, and that's essentially when an action potential arrives at that secretory region. Then, in response, the neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic cleft. So while there's a lot of variety in structure, and so we're going to look at the different structures associated with a neuron, all of them possess a region called the cell body, and from it there extend one or more processes that are the dendrites and the axons. So here in this picture we can see this is essentially the cell body here. There's its nucleus. Oops. Lost that part. There we are. So that's cell body and nucleus. You can make out all the nissl bodies in there, the chromatophilic substance. And then we see all of these processes extending from the cell body. So some of them are dendrites, others of them are one of them is an axon. There's the process that is the axon. Okay. So let's take a look at the pieces and parts, and we'll do it one at a time. The cell body, sometimes referred to as the soma, that would be Greek, I think. I'm not sure if it's Greek or Latin. Actually, probably Latin. This would be the Greek, the perikaryon. Karyon would be associated with the... Well, I don't know. It doesn't matter. But these are other terms. Soma, I know I learned that when I was in college. Perikaryon, I don't think that there are going to be many people who use that term anymore. So the cell body is of most neurons in the body are located as part of the central nervous system, and they contain inside them a very large spherical nucleus, and there are lots of nucleoli, very obvious nucleoli. So if we look here at this one, the one on the right, you can see, hopefully you can see my little cursor. I'm circling the nucleus, and then I'll put my little dot right on top of 1, 2, possibly a third, hard to tell, nucleoli inside the nucleus. The cytoplasm is real grainy looking, and it has all the usual organelles with the exception of centrioles. They don't have centrioles, and this is part of the reason why they are unable to divide, because centrioles are required for the process of cellular and nuclear division. The cytoplasm also contains what are referred to as Nissl bodies. These are clusters of rough ER, and they give the cell body a grayish color. So it gives it this, when we talk about gray matter of the brain, for instance, it's the Nissl bodies that are providing that gray coloration. So frequently, cell bodies are clustered together because they are sharing or they have a related or common function. And so when we see a cluster of cell bodies in the central nervous system, that's referred to as a nucleus. And I know that's confusing because a cell body also has a nucleus in it, but if we have a whole bunch of them, we talk about it as a nucleus, and I'm sorry about that. But the plural would be nuclei. And if it is in the peripheral nervous system, then this cluster of cell bodies that are all having axons going to the same location, those would be a ganglion, or plural is ganglia. So ganglion is a cluster of neuron cell bodies found in the peripheral nervous system. A nucleus is a cluster of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. And notice that it's only the cell bodies that are found in the ganglion or in the nucleus. The axons, if it's in the peripheral nervous system, we'll talk about the bound together, bundled up axons that are all coming from that ganglion are referred to as a nerve. The dendrites, don't have to worry about that. Just know that it's the cell bodies that are found clustered in these nuclei or ganglia. Dendrites are generally found in abundance. They are interesting. I skipped over here. Let me go back before we look at this slide. I've got to go back. I'm looking at my notes and my slides and not always getting it all together. But here we have the processes. Neuron processes are extensions off of the cell body, and they are found in the organs of the central nervous system. So the brain, the spinal cord, have many processes associated with them. The peripheral nervous system contains mainly neuron processes. It's not much else but the processes, except for the ganglia that are found throughout the peripheral nervous system. And in the central nervous system, we refer to these bundles of processes as tracts. So there are tracts that carry information from one location of the brain to another location, or from one location in the spinal cord to the brain, or vice versa. In the peripheral nervous system, these bundles of neuron processes are referred to either as nerves or nerve fibers. So a nerve or a nerve fiber, those are the same things. That's a term. Those terms are interchangeable. Okay, so what are these processes? The first kind of process is referred to as a dendrite. Generally, a single cell body will have numerous dendrites. They are usually short, And they may be highly branched, and so we're seeing these neurons here. So if we look at this one, for instance, you can see lots of branching patterns in the dendrites that extend from the cell body. At the branch ends, we find the receptive surface of the neuron, so the place where it picks up information from other neurons or from sensory structures. And so the function of the dendrite then is to bring information to the cell body. And it brings it in a very specific kind of form, not as an action potential, but what's referred to as a local depolarization, or sometimes just as a local potential. So these local potentials, and we'll discuss them more in later lectures, but a local potential is a small change in the electrical qualities of the membrane of the dendrite. And it spreads a little ways and then kind of peters out. So it's not one of these action potentials that has the ability to travel over long distances. It's a very short range, hence the term local potential. The other kind of process that extends from the cell body is the axon. There's only one axon per cell body. So it's a single, very thin, slender process that arises from a mound on the cell body. And there we can see this mound called the axon hillock. A hillock would be like a little hill. So the axon hillock is the region of the cell body where the axon arises from the cell body. And axons may be very long, as I've mentioned before. We've got these axons that extend all the way down the length of the leg, or they may be relatively short. So many axons in the central nervous system are actually very short. And they are capable of branching as well. These branches coming off of, and I'm going to draw one in here, those branches coming off of the axon are referred to as collaterals. So here's the collateral. If something is collateral, it means it goes along with. And it's just a branch of the axon that then allows that axon to synapse with more than one cell. So with multiple collaterals branching off of the axon, then this one single neuron is capable of communicating with multiple cells. And when you get down to the very tip of the axon, it branches extensively and forms what are referred to as axon terminals. These are the little ends of each of the axon tips. So let's say we've got an axon, comes down to an end, it branches multiple times. So now we've got 3 of these axon terminals, and they terminate at the very end with a little swollen area that's called the synaptic knob. So you can see this little bulbous zone of the synaptic knob. I didn't do a good job of getting that to connect, but hopefully you get what I'm trying to show here. So there will be multiple tips, axon terminals, that kind of swell at the end to form the synaptic knob. And that synaptic knob always ends right near the end, let's try that again. That synaptic knob ends near the receptive surface of another neuron or another effector cell. So it could be a muscle or a gland. But those two receptive surfaces, the receptive surface and that synaptic knob, the transmitting surface, they are close to each other. They're within very, very tiny distance of each other, but they don't actually touch. So there is no connection between the two. And they are instead separated by a little fluid-filled space that's referred to as the synaptic cleft. And that region where, let's say if this is a neuromuscular junction, that region here is referred to as a synapse. And it would be the same if we had a axon terminal was synapsing with something here. There's multiple branches off, but we're only going to look at this one. It might synapse with another neuron, in which case here we have the receptive surface of a dendrite. And again, this whole area is referred to as the synapse, and here's the synaptic cleft that separates the receptive surface of a dendrite and the transmitting surface of the synaptic knob. Okay, so now if we were to classify a neuron based on its structure, based on how it's constructed, then there are three types of neurons. The first is a multipolar neuron. So that means that by multipolar, it means that there are multiple endpoints or multiple regions of reception, but only, of course, because there's only one axon, would be found in these multipolar neurons. So here we see a multipolar neuron, lots of dendrites. So the dendrites are heavily branched. So lots of dendrites and a single axon. And these are the most common, and they're the primary type of neuron that's found in the central nervous system, so in the brain and spinal cord. Almost all, or by far, most of them are these multipolar neurons. And they're functionally, and we're going to look at functional classifications as well. Functionally, these are generally association neurons and motor neurons, or interneurons and motor neurons. Those are similar terms. Okay, so here we see a multipolar neuron, single axon, but multiple dendrites that are coming off of the cell body. Same with these guys here. This smear of neurons, they're all multipolar neurons. There are bipolar neurons. These are neurons that have an axon, one axon extending from the cell body, and only one dendrite extending from the opposite side of the cell body. Now these are not a very common kind of neuron. They are found in some of the specialized sense organs. We're going to talk about them as well. Never mind. I'm going to take that back. So they're found in some of the special senses. So in the retina, the olfactory cells, those are cells that are involved in the sense of smell. And some of the sensory neurons that are found in the inner ear about balance, and especially are these kinds of bipolar neurons. So bipolar, two poles, and that indicates the two processes that extend from opposite sides of the cell body. And notice here in this particular slide it was labeled as the soma. Soma means cell body. But here you can see a single dendrite and a single axon with the axon hillock. And then finally, there are unipolar neurons. Unipolar neurons have one very short process coming off of the cell body. So here it is. And then it comes to a T and forms two processes at that point. And those so here it's really hard to call one an axon and one a dendrite. And so instead they're referred to as peripheral processes and central process. So the peripheral process, one end, we'll assume it's this one here, it functions as a dendrite, and it's usually located out in the periphery of the body. So if this is, say, a motor neuron, then let me rethink that. A sensory neuron. So here's a sensory neuron that's out there. It's got this dendrite that is out there in the periphery. And then the central process conducts the impulse toward the central nervous system. So here we have the central process, here is the peripheral process. And so these generally function as sensory neurons with their sensory tips out here associated further away from the central nervous system, with the ganglion somewhere near the central nervous system, so all of the cell bodies would be clustered together into a ganglion, and then a shorter process that would extend into the spinal cord, let's say, and would connect there to, or would synapse there with an interneuron. Okay, so unipolar neurons, primarily the sensory neurons that are found in the periphery of the body. So we can also classify neurons based on their function and the direction that the nerve impulse travels with respect to the central nervous system. So sensory neurons, sometimes called afferent neurons, and I'll help you distinguish between afferent neurons and the opposite, where information is being transmitted away from the central nervous system in a minute when we talk about that term for the motor neuron. So sensory neurons are afferent, and that means that the information travels along an axon headed toward the central nervous system, toward being the key word to associate with afferent. The dendrites in the cell body lie outside the central nervous system, but the axon is found making a synapse inside the central nervous system. The cell bodies are clustered usually in sensory ganglia, and they generally have very long dendritic or peripheral processes and a very short axonal or central process. So, peripheral, oops, sorry about that, peripheral, and this one is the central process. Almost all of these sensory neurons are unipolar neurons, except for very few, and we've already talked about them, the bipolar neurons associated with some of the special senses. A special sense, by the way, is a sense that requires a very elaborate organ to function. So we're talking about gustation, that's taste, and olfaction, that's smell, and vision, and hearing, and equilibrium. Those are all the special senses. So there are sensory neurons, there are motor neurons. These are called efferent neurons, and they carry information away from the central nervous system toward the, and here's how you can remember it, toward the effector tissues, the tissues that are going to cause the effect. So these would be the muscles and glands that are associated with whatever the neuron is and its function. And so efferent neurons carry information away from the point of reference, the spinal cord in this case, or the brain. Their cell bodies and the dendrites are usually found inside the central nervous system, usually in the spinal cord, except for some of the neurons associated with the autonomic nervous system. We'll talk more about the autonomic nervous system later in another lecture. They generally have relatively short dendrites and a long axon. So that long axon extending out toward whatever that motor tissue is. Maybe it's a muscle telling it to contract, or maybe it's a gland telling it to secrete. And all of these motor neurons are multipolar neurons. And here, in this example, this is a reflex that this drawing is showing. We have a sensory neuron here that has a long dendrite. Then it comes up, passes through a ganglion just outside of the spinal cord, and then the central process carries the action potential on into the spinal cord. Here we see the third kind of functional classification of neuron, an interneuron. But here is, so we have a cell body there in the spinal cord, very short dendrites that are collecting information from that interneuron, and then a long axon that carries the message out to the muscles, in this case, telling them to contract. And then last of all, the third kind of functional classification is an interneuron, sometimes referred to as an association neuron, because they help sensory and motor neurons to associate with each other. They hang out with them. An interneuron is always located entirely in the central nervous system, in either the brain or the spinal cord. And their job is to transmit signals between neurons, from one neuron to another. And so they are essentially the pathways that connect a sensory neuron to a motor neuron. And it's not always, here in this reflex, we're seeing only one interneuron, but that is certainly not always the case. There may be many, many hundreds of thousands of neurons in between the sensory and the motor neuron. And they are primarily multipolar neurons, and they usually have very short dendrites. And by far, these are the most abundant of any of the neuron functional types in the body. As many as 90% of all neurons in the body are actually found in the brain or spinal cord as interneurons. Okay, so there you have it. We've talked about neurons, about their receiving component, the dendrites, about their transmitting component, the axon, and about the cell body. And then we classified them first by structure. So if they had many processes off of them, including one axon, then that's a multipolar neuron. If they have a single very short process that branches then to form a peripheral or a central process, that would be a unipolar neuron. And then if they have a single axon branching right off the cell body, and on the opposite side a single dendrite that brings information toward the cell body, then we refer to that as a bipolar neuron. And then last of all, we talked about the functional classification of sensory neurons bringing afferent impulses into the central nervous system, the motor neurons bringing efferent pulses away from the central nervous system and connecting to or synapsing with the effector tissues of muscles and glands that are out in the periphery of the body. And finally, the interneurons, the multipolar neurons that make up the bulk of the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so there you have it. Everything you ever wanted to know about neurons, but we're afraid to ask. You know how to reach me, though, if you have more that you want to know.